So it's going to be nice to take a break from our thread painting to putting the binding on our quilt. And if you remember in a video that we did about making continuous binding, and then we rolled it on this toilet tissue roll. And so anyway, when we folded that 3-inch strip in half, we have 1.5 inches. And remember, I was talking about how we wanted to have at least a 1/2 inch wide binding. So I just took a scrap of binding that was the same width and experimented. I stitched this at a scant 1/2 inch because to do this, judges like the binding to be full. So if you have just a scant 1/2 inch there, I marked this with a tape, then you have this one turn that's 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch up, and then 1/2 inch down to our line. I don't like to have to pull this too tight, so that's why I like to check this on a piece of scrap. This was just one of our things that we practiced stitching on, so I just practiced putting that binding on. So that's why we started out with 3-inch wide binding, because now for putting the sleeve on the quilts with this new hanging apparatus that we have, they want the sleeve to be at least 1/2 inch below the top of the quilt. So that's why I make 1/2 inch wide binding. So I know this is going to work. And now we're ready to go ahead and put our binding onto our quilt. This is our binding. I'm just going to drop it in a little trash can. I removed the trash first. And now I'm going to just start on this side of the binding. I'm going to skip down here about 8 inches, something like that. And now I'm going to bring this up to my edge. I've already tested that that's going to give us the right width. And I'm going to just line this up and start stitching. Okay. I want to make sure it's on my line here. All right, now that we're coming up to our corner, our first corner, we want to stop approximately 1/2 inch before the end there. And what I could do is put a little dot there. Okay, I'm just going to put a dot where I want to stop because it's hard for me to judge this sometimes. So I'm coming up to the edge. That's good. Bring the needle up, cut my thread, and I'm going to make a corner, one of my first corners here. So we pivoted this, and now what we're going to do is fold this up like that. Make a right angle, just like that. Crease it with your finger and fold this down. Have those edges meet, and then finish stitching. There's just a lot of stuff here that needs to be trimmed up, but it's okay. Just kind of make a right angle there. Those corners, those line up, and we're gonna follow this. I guess I could cut those, but I'm too lazy. So that's the way we do the corners. All right, we've been around all 4 sides of our quilt, and oh joy, look, we have plenty of binding. I was so afraid maybe we'd be a little shy, but we made it. And so I wanted to show you how I join these tails. And the first thing I should mention is before you put your binding on your quilt, make sure you squared it up first. That's very important. All right, so now I'm going to show you how I join these tails. I'm going to stitch down here and leave maybe a few inches on either way, and then I'll show you how I do this. I'm going to just come down just a little more. All right, I'm going to bring my quilt out of the machine. I love this little angle, easy angle that I have. That's so helpful for splicing the bindings together. I'm going to open it up. See, open it up. And I want these to overlap a little bit. So I'm going to open this up. And now I'm going to use my little angle. I'm going to have a little space there. I'm going to use this and see, make sure that they're overlapped a little bit. It's maybe 1.5 inches, something like that. And I'm going to mark that line. I'm going to trim that off at that angle. I have a hard time seeing that, but it's there. Okay, I can throw that little tail away. And now what I'm going to do is take my glue stick and I'm going to turn up a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to guess that. So I just put glue there. And now I'm just going to turn that seam allowance up just a little bit. There are many ways to do this, but for me it's always so confusing, and usually I'm trying to put my binding on in the middle of the night and I can't remember which way to turn stuff so you can sew it. So I've improvised. So I've turned my edge there, and then I'm just going to take this other tail and put it in there, tuck it in there. All right, now I'm going to finish stitching down there, and then when I turn the binding back, when I'm slip stitching the back, the binding to the back of the quilt, I'll just slip stitch that little corner as well. Oops. So now I just bring this back into my machine and finish stitching down there. I can just pull that over just a little bit. Okay, now I want to show you how I make my sleeves. I told you that they want the sleeves to be 1/2 inch from the top, and they also want the sleeves with this extra little about 1/4 inch space in here for the new hanging apparatus. But it's hard to see on this black and white fabric, so I cut this little sample. They have nice rulers, these 8.5 inch rulers, because you cut your strips 8.5 inches wide. But they tell you to fold it in half and mark it. Well, what I do to create this extra 1/2 inch automatically from the beginning is, instead of creasing that at 1/2 inch, I move this down approximately 1/4 inch. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Okay, and then I'm going to crease it there. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and stitch just very scantily along that edge. By moving this down, you'll see what happens. We'll make a nice little pocket with extra space in it. But I'm going to stitch just very scantily along this edge. It will give me a nice place to stitch that onto my quilt, that extra little tiny stitching there, but I'll show you. I'll go over to the sewing machine now and show you that. So this is my sleeve that I folded down from the top, not in half, but I folded it down about 1/4 of an inch. And I just kind of have this right between the toes of my walking foot. Use your walking foot. Some of these sleeves get pretty long. Okay, now you can see my scant stitching line, and that will be for me to slip stitch this this sleeve to my quilt later on, rather than just following a folded or a crease fabric, which I can't see. Now I have a line to go by. Now to create that extra space that they want, now I bring these two pieces together, and I usually pin it on a long piece. I just bring that up, and now we're going to stitch the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. All right, now you can see that creates a little pocket for the hanging apparatus. Now this would be the short side that you want next to the quilt, and this is the side with the extra little space that is facing the, out from the back. And then this line right here, we can pin that on the quilt and have a nice line for slip stitching that down to the quilt. Then to attach your sleeve to the quilt top, I fold the quilt in half, find my center mark, and then I also fold my sleeve in half. And now the tricky thing here is you just want to remember that you have the puffy side facing out from the back. So we're just going to go ahead and pin this. All right, to make this line up correctly, I use the stitching line for my sleeve and the stitching line that I attach the binding to the quilt, and just use a pin and go through that. And then I'll follow this line to stitch that sleeve onto the quilt. So I'm just lining up my stitching lines with a pin. You don't have to pin this, but every couple inches. What I did was pin this because I wanted to keep those two lines lined up, put my pins in following the line instead of this way, so that it would hold the position better. And then before you do this, you want to make sure your binding is pinned out of the way. We don't want to sew that in here, so I'm just going to put another pin there to keep that binding out of the way while we do this stitching line. I should say that I did turn under the two short ends before I was showing you how to fold and press your sleeve and then stitch it. So now I'm going to just baste this in here. It doesn't need to be stitched down closely. So now I'm just following that original stitching line. And always make sure that your binding wasn't caught in there, that it's folded back out of the way. We don't want to have to rip anything out at this point. Okay, so this is the binding that will be turned back. And here we have our extra little puffy part for the sleeve, but now we have a nice edge. We want to see, you can just pull this straight out here so the flat side is next to the body of the quilt and the puffy side is out for the hanging stuff. But now I'll go take this over to my work table and spread it out, and I'll put some pins here. And now I have a very nice line for slip stitching that. when they just had you crease it, I couldn't see that crease, and it was always getting away from me. So by sewing a scanty stitching line there, I have a nice edge for slip stitching the sleeve on, and the top of the sleeve is in the binding. So then we'll be just turning the binding back too. And now I'm happy to have a sit-down job to finish all this handwork. And I hope you enjoyed this tip for binding and the sleeve.